Welcome everyone and good evening. You are in the Budget 101 webinar with the City of New Westminster. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Jennifer Miller and I'm the Manager of Public Engagement with the City of New West, and I will be facilitating the session this evening. And I'm here with Lisa Spitali, our Chief Administrative Officer, and Lorraine Lyle, who is our Manager of Financial Services. We are so pleased that you're here. Thank you for joining us. I did want to let you know that we are recording this session and we will be posting it on our website by tomorrow is the plan, should technology be on our side. So you can always refer to the recording down the road, and we will also be posting the presentation slides as well. Actually, any of you who have registered for the session through Eventbrite, we will send out an email with links to those resources afterwards. All right, so I just want to give a quick technology tutorial about how you can interact with us through the session this evening. If you need any technical help, you can click the Q&A button. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. It may also be up at the top, but if you look at your menu, you should have a little icon that says Q&A with some speech bubbles. Please click on that and maybe keep that window open. You can type in there any technical questions you may have, but also when we get into our Q&A time a little bit later after we do the presentation, that's where you can submit your questions for Lisa and for Lorraine. So if you want to ask a question about the city budget or a question to Lisa and Lorraine, you can click that Q&A, type in your question and press submit. But you can also like other people's questions. So if you see a question that you would really like to have answered this evening, you can click that thumbs up and then it'll bump those ones up to the top of the list. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can in the time we have this evening, but that's one of the ways of making sure that, that you get your most important questions answered by pressing that thumbs up. For those of you who may be participating by telephone, you can press *9 on your phone to kind of raise your hand virtually, and that will show us that you have a question, and we will call on you a little bit later when we get into the Q&A. If you decide you don't have a question anymore, or you've heard the information you were looking for, you can press that *9 again at any time to remove your request. So *9 to raise your hand or request to speak, *9 again to remove your request. All right, I have a quick poll to get us started so that we can find out a little bit about who's joining us tonight. So I am going to put that up on the screen now. So you should see a window on your screen there and you should be able to answer this question. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. Give me one moment and I will change it. Okay, my apologies. Okay, so our question is, what are your connections to New West? And please select all that apply. So we're just wanting to know who's joining us on the session this evening. We'll give just a few seconds there for people to put in their answers, and then I'll show you the results. All right, just a couple more seconds here for anyone who hasn't got their answers in. I see most of you have put them in, and apologies if you're on the phone, you won't be able to answer the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share those results. So we have a good mix of folks on the line or on the webinar with us this evening. We've got some tenants, some homeowners, business owners, a student, and some people who work in New West, and a few in the other category as well. Great, and again, thank you so much for choosing to spend some of your time with us this evening. All right, I'm going to take this down, and I just have a few opening remarks before we get into the presentation and for the information that you came here for tonight. So the purpose of our webinar is to share information with residents, business operators, and property owners about how the city's finances work. We're really covering the basics on this Budget 101, where the money comes from, how it gets allocated to different parts of the city's operations, And of course, we're here to answer your questions. So we'll be getting to that a little bit later. And again, please use that Q&A window to submit those questions. So through our Budget 2020 engagement that we did late in 2019 and earlier this year, we really heard through that process that many community members would like more information about the fundamentals of the city budget process, city finances, and how the budget process, how the budget is developed and completed each year. So this webinar is directly in response to that input from the community. It is truly a 101 approach, and we are covering the basics tonight. So we hope that it's the information that you're looking for, and it's what we feel we were asked for from the community through our Budget 2020 process. So our agenda for this evening, we're in the Welcome and Housekeeping right now. We will have a presentation from Lisa and Lorraine on Budget 101. And then we'll do the moderated question and answer. Again, you can type your questions into that Q&A. And then we'll have a bit of wrap up and next steps, and we'll let you know about our online survey that we are launching this evening as part of our Budget 2021 engagement process. So my role for this evening is really to just help us move through the agenda. I'll be moderating the Q&A, and our goal is to get to as many of your questions as we can in the time that we have together this evening. And I would just like to ask everyone to join me in committing to these participation guidelines or values for our time together this evening, just that we keep respect at the top of our mind. We will do the best with the technology. So we are all still kind of learning our new online life through COVID-19. So we just ask for your patience if we have any little slip-ups, like putting the wrong poll question up for you earlier, just a few minutes ago. We ask that you challenge ideas, not people. Of course, it is great to disagree, and we don't expect everyone to agree on everything, but we just ask that you don't make it personal. We only speak for ourselves, so you may have had lots of great conversations with your neighbors about city finances, we hope, but they are not here this evening and you are, so we just ask that you speak for yourself. And finally, we value diversity and inclusion. So I'll just ask everyone who's with us this evening to commit to these, that we will together keep to these guidelines as we proceed through our time. Thank you. All right, and as I mentioned, our presenters for this evening are Lisa Spitali, our Chief Administrative Officer, sorry about that, Lisa, and Lorraine Lyle, who is our Manager of Financial Services. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa to get us going with the presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Let me just move my screen over a bit so I can see the slides. So I'm going to start with ending our lessons learned from our 2020 budget process last time. So one of the main things that you told us was we needed to do a far better job to demystify the budget process. And that was probably one of our key learnings. You said to us, the budget's far more complicated than you'd realized. There was lots of parts to it. And that really, it was our responsibility as city staff to break it down, make it clear, and probably most importantly, do a better job of showing you where your engagement in the public, the budget process is actually meaningful. So we're taking that to heart. So when we step right back, what are we responsible for? So fundamentally, the city is a service provider. We're here to actually provide you in the community services. And in general terms, the services fall under three basic categories: essential services, core services, and priorities or strategic priorities. And you probably heard us, even during the COVID process, talking a lot about really focusing on essential and core services when we were really at the midst of the pandemic. So it's important to understand sort of what these are, and then ultimately how that affects our own budget and our own budget process. So what are our essential services? Well, basically, we tend to think of things like fire and police. Those essential services that tend to have an emergency and life safety sort of component to it. We also have core services. We typically think of things like garbage collection, sewer and water, the work we do with in the electrical utility. All of that tends to be a core service. A lot of our regulatory functions fall under what we would call our core services. For example, building code compliance, building inspections, fire inspections, all core services of the municipality. Then the last category is priorities. So we talk about things like City Council strategic plan, the 7 bold steps with climate action, the official community plan. There's a series of priorities that council sets, typically informed by public policy and community engagement. They always have an implementation plan, and implementation plans always have budgetary components, right? So when you look at it that way, so it's really, I think it's clear to look at sort of city services broken down like that. And the reason we do that is as we go through this budget discussion, you'll get a sense of really how different services get aligned in different budgets and in different categories. So next slide. So probably I think probably the most important thing to realize in when we have a budget process, which is ultimately where we spend our money, is that it's iterative. It is not a linear process. It isn't a top-down process. It's an iterative process. And it really is a function of several different influences. Ultimately, we want to create a 5-year financial plan. And from a transparency and a good government perspective, that shows you, that shows the community, that shows everyone else really where our commitments over time. But in order to create that, we sort of have broken them down into 3 kind of overall buckets. So what we're calling sort of an internal influence. So this comes from city departments themselves. Things like our asset management program. An asset management program, it includes things like our road infrastructure, parkade infrastructure, our buildings, all of those things that departments actually manage on behalf of the community. We also have under the existing guiding documents and policies bucket, things like the official community plan, the parks and open space plan, these major documents, major policies that in and of themselves have plans, have implementation programs, have budgets assigned to them over time. And then we also have what we're calling just external influences. And in many cases, either regulations from senior levels of government, things that we are reacting to, also as regulators we need to respond to. That all comes together. Now, one of the questions that the public had for us during our 2020 process was, where exactly is input? Where does it work? How does it work? Where's the value add? And so in that little box right there, we've tried to identify some of the key places where public engagement, community input is really well aligned. So we have workshops that we do in the community. There's committee meetings, task force meetings, council meetings. There's presentations. Probably the one of the more transparent one is also when we create new plans like the official community plan, parks master plans, all those bigger documents that are informed by community engagement. That's our way of then reinforcing sort of what's important to the community values, sort of written up as policy documents, then going to council in a very formal way. And then that all becomes embedded in how overall decisions are made. Okay, Jennifer, over. And now over to Lorraine.
You're on mute, Lorraine.
I see that. I got my big message. There we go. Technology snag number 1. So thank you, Lisa, and good evening, webinar participants. Tonight, I am going to review the 3 main components of the financial plan: the city's capital program, the operating program, and reserves. From the little diagram there, we show that these link and they all go together to build a financial plan. The capital program typically includes the purchase and maintenance of city assets. The operating program includes the delivery of city services through the departments. Reserves are established to assist with fiscal management, to replace long-term assets, provide for future capital programs, comply with legislations, and provide assurance of financial stability. Through the presentation, I will review some details about each of these components and the linkages between them. Next. Thank you. Starting with the operating program. The first piece of the operating program is operating revenues. Please note that all of the data that's in this presentation refers to the 2020 to 2024 financial plan figures. This is the beginning of our budget process, and we don't have budget data for 21 to 25. The city has a number of sources of operating revenue. The two largest ones are property taxes and utilities, both of which provide about 37% of the city's revenues. The city operates 4 utilities: electrical, water, sewer, and solid waste. Property tax and utility rates are set annually during the budget process. Other city-generated revenues are shown on the chart as sale of services and other income. Included in those categories are mostly user pay items, such as parking, program registration, event fees, permits, development application fees. As well, the city earns income on investments that it has, which primarily represent reserves that have been set aside for future use. The city also receives grants and contributions from third parties. These fluctuate from year to year and depend on the programs available. Next. It is important to note that the property tax dollars that the city and the residents and businesses pay to the city are not all for City of New Westminster property taxes. The city is required to collect property taxes on behalf of provincial and other authorities, including school tax, TransLink, BC Assessment, Municipal Finance Authority, Metro Vancouver, and business improvement areas. 36 cents of each dollar the city collects is passed on, and only 64 cents of each dollar collected is available to fund city services. There's some missing information about the wedges there. TransLink is 6%, Metro Vancouver is 1%, and BC Assessment is 1% for added information. Next. The next piece of the operating program is expenses. As Lisa mentioned, the city is a service provider. This chart shows the variety of functional areas in the city that provide services to the public or internally to other departments. As you can see from the chart, the largest percentage of expenses are incurred by the electric utility. This is because the expenses include the purchase of electricity, which is that utility's largest expense. The other 3 city utilities that are overseen by the engineering department are 12% of the expenses. The non-utility functions of engineering are numerous and include street maintenance, cemeteries, project management, parking, animal services, and building maintenance. My lists are not exhaustive, so I'm hoping I don't leave too many people out. The critical services of emergency response for the city are fire and rescue and police, and make up 25% of the operating expense. As Lisa pointed out, these are considered core and required for safety and health. Parks and Recreation, which is 11%, is responsible for the operation of the wide variety of programs in our recreation facilities, which include pools, recreation centers, arenas, and community centers. They also keep our parks inviting places to visit. Development services, 3% of the expenses, includes planning, permitting, bylaw enforcement. The library not only provides lending services at 2 locations where they have fabulous book collections, but also they have computers available for public use. General government, which is 13% of the expense pie, includes all other departments at the city, including legislative services, information technology, human resources, arts, culture, Anvil Center, communications, engagement, and yes, finance. So you can see the city does a lot of very different things. We have multiple teams that do have many various skills. The next. This slide shows the major categories of operating expenses within the departments. As a service provider, the largest expense of the city is staffing costs. This accounts for approximately 68% of the general operating budget. The general operating budget does not include utilities. Staffing also accounts for over 50% of the total cash expense, including the utilities. Utility purchases includes the purchase of electricity, as I spoke about before, as well as levies for water purchases, sewer services, and solid waste disposal. To be clear, solid waste includes garbage, recyclables, as well as organics. The operating expenses in the financial plan also include depreciation, sometimes referred to as amortization of city assets. This is a non-cash expense, but is still considered an operating expense. Assets are amortized over their useful life. Debt servicing costs, which is listed here as an operating expense, relates to long-term debt. And each year, the city sets aside funds to reserves for future use. I will discuss these two items in more detail later in the presentation. Key in the operating program is the fact that operating revenues must cover the total cost, the total of the operating expenses, so that we have a balanced budget. This is challenging, and as Lisa pointed out, iterative, as staff and council make decisions about where to allocate funds. And moving to something just a little different, just to compare to household finance. Anyone who's responsible for household finances has experience with this kind of decision making. Typically, there will be a revenue source which provides a finite amount of funds to deal with. Much of this will be consumed by our day-to-day living expenses. We would also maybe like to set aside some funds for some one-time or major upcoming event, or to purchase something special. If we use all of the income to cover day-to-day expenses, we will not be able to set aside those savings. If we determine that savings, or the things we want to save for, are important, we may need to adjust our day-to-day living expenses to achieve that goal. Or maybe we need to find another income source, the side hustle. Again, an iterative process. Moving to the capital program. This slide depicts factors that must be taken into account when dealing with the capital program. These factors also influence the operating program, but are more so part of the decision-making in the capital program. Staff must consider the need to continue to provide core services and maintain critical infrastructure. There are council priorities as outlined in the strategic plan. The 7 bold steps have been identified that the city has adopted since the declaration of the climate emergency. And as well, opportunities arise through grants or partnerships as we're going through the planning process, or even changing after we've decided on a 5-year program. Next slide. Thank you. The capital program is made up of numerous projects. Many are for the maintenance, replacement, expansion, or upgrading of existing assets. Some are for new facilities. Some enhance community services. This chart shows how the current 5-year program is allocated among asset types. We have buildings for 32%, engineering structures, which includes roads, sewer and water facilities, for not sewer and water, pardon me, just roads, sidewalks, those types of things, 15%. Land acquisitions is just 1%. Park improvements, 3%. Vehicles and equipment, including information technology, which is becoming more and more important in our lives, is 6%. Water infrastructure is 5%, sewer infrastructure 10%. Electrical distribution system is 24%. That is quite high in the 5-year plan as we look towards the district energy system. The other projects, which account for 4%, are many important projects. They are things like affordable housing, childcare, arts. So again, a huge variety of types of projects that city staff engage in. A key part of the development of the capital program is determining where the funds will come from to cover the costs. Next. The capital program is funded through a combination of grants and contributions, development cost charges that come from developers, long-term debt, and reserves. This chart shows that in the current 5-year program, the funding is primarily from debt and reserves. So speaking a little bit about debt, which is the next slide. The city has the ability to borrow long-term debt to finance capital projects. Prior to borrowing, the city goes through an alternative approval process for public input. The authority for the city to borrow is then granted through a bylaw that is approved by council. All of the city's long-term debt is financed through the Municipal Finance Authority of BC. The city's current debt was used for projects such as the police building, Moody Park Pool, New Westminster Electrical Substation, City Hall, and library renovations. As you can see from the chart, the amount of debt is planned to increase substantially over the next 4 years to fund the city's ambitious capital plan. Approval has been given for debt for the Queensborough substation and the Canada Games pool replacement. The 5-year plan anticipates new debt for public realm projects, district energy, and the Massey Theatre. It is important to note that there is a link back to operating expenses from debt, and that is debt servicing costs. Hence, there is an impact on the balancing of the budget, which is a link to property taxes. And on to reserves. This is one of Lisa's favorite subjects. Reserves can be likened to savings set aside for future events. The city builds up reserve funds and then uses them primarily to fund projects in the capital program. The sources of reserve funds are listed here. As we've talked about before, developer contributions, land sales, casino revenues, which sadly have dried up at the moment, digital signage, and levies. Along with those, we also have the annual contribution from operating expenses. As you can see from the graph, the level of reserves is projected to decline as the city funds some major projects and then slowly starts to rebuild. It's also important to note that some reserve funds are subject to specific regulation that limits their use. It is key, though, to note that there is the link back to operating expenses. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, each year the city sets aside funds as annual contributions to reserves. This has an impact on operating expenses, which also then impacts property taxes because of the revenue requirement to balance the budget. I'm hoping that this overview has helped to show how the various components of the financial plan are linked. These linkages and all of the influences that Lisa spoke of make the budget process complex and indeed iterative. Just to step away from the city and looking at personal context for a moment, reserves and debt can also be looked at in a personal context. In the previous personal example, we looked at setting aside savings. When you make your plan, you may have a targeted amount that you want to achieve to save for something specific. But plans can change because of other influencing factors so that your savings get used for an unplanned event. Then if you want to proceed with the original intent, you would have to borrow funds to do so. Those funds, of course, have to be repaid, which then increases your day-to-day expenses, and we have the same iterative process, making new choices to balance your budget. So what does it all really mean? Most of the programs that you see and need are covered in the operating program. Facilities, infrastructure, and such are in the capital program. Reserves and debt link these two programs. Many things in both programs are core and essential, but there are opportunities for influencing the priorities in these programs. The city provides opportunities for engagement all year round regarding specific projects, plans, and strategies. Your input is important for the city to work towards meeting your needs and preferences. Some of the opportunities Lisa outlined when she did her introduction in the presentation, and there are workshops, council meetings, information sessions. We encourage your participation. Thank you.
So this one is our last slide, and I want us to remember that we're still in COVID, and one of the difficulties with COVID is we have to actually do engagement work differently, and that as a city and as a community, we've been greatly impacted by COVID. So we know that COVID has affected many residents, many businesses in a way that is affecting everyday life, people's quality of life, and their well-being, their revenues, their businesses, and at the same time, it's also affected cities' revenue sources. And as we're dealing and struggling with the pandemic, the city needs to recognize that our budget process, where we spend our money, where we prioritize, must have a COVID lens. We continue to do pandemic work, dealing with the issues of vulnerable populations. We're going to continue to do that. Those have always been services that we've prioritized during the pandemic, and we're going to continue to do so. And so when we continue with the challenges with COVID, addressing areas that we've got reduced revenues and our own inherent challenges with engagement, we have to find a way to continue the work that we need to do in the budget process and provide you with opportunities so that you can actually value add in appropriate ways. And so that's really going to be our focus over the next several weeks, is you informing us. Hopefully we're giving you the appropriate information you need. City staff taking that information and being very transparent with where that information actually helps us prioritize some of our spending decisions. And if we're not doing that, you need to tell us that, because then we're falling down on the commitment that we've made to all of you, even as part of our 2020 budget process, that we were going to do a far better job of breaking down the budget and the budget process and how decisions get put together and how your input is valuable and move forward. But also to recognize that we're in COVID and we're going to be engaging differently. We know that many people are really tired of Zoom meetings and really feeling disengaged, but we're still going to have to find ways to continue to reach out, seek your input, and then in a very transparent way, show how your input becomes part of our decision-making process when we look at funding priorities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Lisa and Lorraine, for that presentation. So now the rest of our time together, pretty much until about 7:25, is going to be in our Q&A. So I would invite everyone to open up that question and answer box that should be in your Zoom menu. You should see Q&A with an icon there. Please open that up and put your questions in there. I do see we have Fulton on the call who's raised his hand. So We will take a few verbal questions as well, if that's your preference. And again, for those of you who are on the phone, you can press *9 to virtually raise your hand, and we can hear from you as well. So I will be prioritizing the questions in the Q&A box, so I would encourage everyone to use that. And so without further ado, we're going to start off here with a bit of a long question by someone who's named Budget Keener. Thanks for being so keen and interested in our budget process. Does reducing operating expenses or increasing revenue, i.e. tax increases above the inflation rate, increase the capital spending room? What is the pay down period for capital projects? Assuming low interest rates, my working assumption is that every $1 of operating expense reduction, this could free up $10 for capital expenses on long-lasting assets. Is this a true statement in broad terms? I'm not sure I even understand this question. Lorraine, I'm hoping that you do, and that you can give us a bit of a plain language answer, so that maybe those of us who aren't as quite as keen on the budget might be able to understand.
Okay, let me try and break it down. It's like it's more than one question embedded there. So I'll try to break it down a bit, and they're not directly related. So does reducing operating or increasing revenue increase capital spending room? Not directly. The capital spending room is influenced by the reserves that are set aside that come out of the operating budget, but it's not a direct link. So it can, if we take more money aside and put it into the reserves, that will provide more funding for future capital spent. That doesn't sound like much of a straight answer, but that's it. Did that make sense to you, Jennifer?
It did, thank you.
Okay. In the pay down period for capital projects, if you're talking about the debt pay down period, that varies depending on the debt arrangement, the terms of the debt. Those are all listed on our annual report for terms, as well as the interest rates on each of the pieces of long-term debt that we have. I do not have them memorized. Assuming low interest rates, my working assumption is every $1 of operating expense reduction could free up $10 for capital expense on long-lasting assets. I'm going to say no again, because it's not a direct relationship. And some of the interest rates that we pay now are historical interest rates. So it's quite a mix, and it's really hard to do a direct correlation than that. But yeah, it's not as straightforward, unfortunately, Keener. I hope that helps a bit.
Thanks very much for that, Lorraine. Moving on to a question from Heidi. What are the interest rates on the city's reserves and debt? I feel like we've started to touch on this a little bit.
So the interest rates on the debt, as I said, depend on the piece of debt that we have. We do have several outstanding debts. Those are all listed in the annual report. Those are adjusted. Every 5 years, we get an adjustment from MFA to current levels. But that information is available in the annual report. And interest rates on the city reserves is dependent on where we have the funds invested. Some of our funds are invested in high interest savings accounts, which we're doing quite well, but those interest rates have dropped to approximately 1%. And some of the reserves are invested in equity funds. Again, we have funds invested through MFA with a variety of yields that fluctuate according to the bond market. Most of our longer term investments are in bond investments.
And Lorraine, what's MFA?
Sorry, Municipal Finance Authority, and their website has some information. Thank you, Lisa. And their website has some information on their operations and the current types of investments that they make on our behalf.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll take one more from the Q&A box, and then we'll go to a verbal question. What percent, this one is from Fulton, thanks for the question, Fulton. What percent decrease in property tax revenue is expected by the current budget year due to COVID-19?
Okay, I'm assuming you want me to try that one, Jennifer?
Sure, I think maybe Lisa might have some follow-up comments, but
Yep.
if you could start us off.
Certainly. If you're speaking about, and I'm assuming you're referring to 2020 property tax revenue, the 2020 property tax revenue will not be impacted by COVID-19. The collection of the cash is being impacted by COVID-19. We will see at the end of the year how much we have in unpaid taxes, but that will be a receivable on the balance sheet, and it will not impact the operating revenue from tax revenue as reported in the statements.
Anything to add to that, Lisa? I think
just, and perhaps the community will recall when we were sort of at the height of COVID, and we were providing a lot of information reports to City Council on a cash flow analysis. And so folks may recall some of the reports that we talked about, looking at, rather than our typical budget process, which is based on priorities and well, basically priorities and our typical spending obligations. We started looking at it based on the amount of cash flow that we had. And so you'll recall throughout COVID, a lot of concern with city operations and the ability to maintain our cash flow because of just decreased revenues from the closure of city facilities, et cetera. People have heard about the casino and others. And so throughout the year, we've been watching our cash flow, but we knew that we wouldn't have a sense of how we were doing until after the property taxes came in. And so we made certain assumptions, really held back on our spending, focused on our spending on areas that were essential and core in the event that property tax revenues were going to come in lower than expected, and we still had the ability to carry out our services and, most importantly, maintain our pandemic response. So that was sort of what we were doing during the year. And so if you look at previous council reports and talk about the cash flow analysis, you'll get a better sense of that relationship of that work and then the impact that COVID had on sort of day-to-day operations.
Great, thanks for that additional context, Lisa. Chris, I'm going to unmute you now so that you can answer your question, or sorry, ask your question to Lisa and or Lorraine.
Probably Lorraine.
I think Lisa.
So Chris Kapasky, if you see a note there, you should be able to unmute yourself and chime in to ask your question. Please go
Okay,
ahead.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We
Yes, we
absolutely can, yeah.
Okay, I got 2 or 3 questions. The first one in general, if we want to get a copy of the notes of these presentation slides sent to us via email, what's the procedure?
So we will be sending out the presentation slides and a link to the presentation slides and the video recording of the webinar to anyone who did register on Eventbrite. So you will receive an email in the next few days with a link to that information. Also, I'll be sharing a website a web page on the city's website about Budget 2021. We'll be posting the information there as well. And Chris, I'll ask you to keep it to just one more question because we do want to get to as many people's questions as possible. Okay. So please one more and then we'll move on.
Sounds good. My question is, during your presentation, you put an opportunity for input from the public. If we have like any ideas or suggestions how the city can allocate the money in the budget, or if we want to relate it to any services to be changed by essential services, say like the police. Like for example, if we would like I live uptown neighborhood, and 6th and 6th, the Belmont Tower property, and there's a degree of homelessness in front of our property, and there's a lot of vagabonds, a lot of trash and dirt and that. It makes our property look really bad. And if we, like, for example, if we went out, asked the police services to have like a manpower police 24/7 to have people move on, this is private property and public property, and sort of make the area cleaner, and the homeless people.
Chris,
I do, yeah.
I'm just going to jump in. So your question is, how can you provide some input to the city on what you'd like to see for the budget and service levels?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. So tonight, just about 5 minutes after this webinar is concluded, we'll have our budget survey open for input, and it's asking about exactly these things that you're talking about. It's asking, what are some of the community's priorities in terms of core services, as well as some of those priority items like the 7 bold steps in climate action and the council's strategic plan. So, and it's asking about all of these things that you're speaking about. We're wanting to understand what's most important to our community members. So as soon as this webinar is concluded, you will have an opportunity to fill out that survey. And as we move forward through the budget process, there will be additional opportunities for you to submit input directly to council, to the finance department, etc. So thank you so much for your question, and I am going to move on to the next one in our Q&A box. This one's from Flannery. Does the city apply a social responsibility lens to its financial investments? For example, screening out fossil fuels, etc.
Yes, thank you for the question, Flannery. Yes, the city has been looking to apply a social responsibility lens to the financial investments. It's very important to the city, very important to council. So through the MFA, we have been able to shift funds from some more traditional streams into some of their new products. The MFA this year, again, the Municipal Finance Authority, has introduced new products in their investment portfolio, and we have moved to take advantage of that and are in the process of moving funds into some of their new fossil fuel-free investment bonds. So it's a fairly new thing for the city, but it's definitely a focus, and we're moving as quickly as we can towards that end.
Great, thanks very much for that, Lorraine. The next question here is from Mike. More simply, do we plan on paying down our debts? Rates are low, but do we have an amortization on project payback like the pool? And then a follow-up question that Mike has entered: if our HISA rates are less than our debt rates, can we pay off our debt? And I'll need you to explain to me what that acronym is, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, so HISA is High Interest Saving Account.
Great, thank you.
Your new acronym for the day, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So we do not currently have a plan to pay down our debts any quicker than the current payback that is in the terms and conditions of our financing arrangements. I do not have an amortization on project payback for the pool. And sorry, the follow-up question was,
yeah, if the high interest saving account rates are less than our debt rates, can we pay off our debt?
Our debts terms are fixed. So at the moment, no.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to we have a participant by phone whose last digits of the phone number end in 265. I'm just giving you a heads up that after the next question from the Q&A box, I'll be unmuting you so that you can ask your question. So one more from the Q&A box: is tree planting a capital expense or operating expense? Which category does this fall into?
All right, Keener, getting to know you. A great question. I actually love this question because it brings up something I didn't cover in the basics of the the presentation, but tree planting is both a capital expense and an operating expense. Tree planting capital projects include sort of acquiring some trees, and we have some major arboricultural initiatives that we are embarking on through this financial plan that require some capital funding to go towards tree planting and increasing the tree stock and increasing the urban canopy. Operating expenses are impacted as well because we need the resources in our staffing in order to carry out the tree planting and the maintenance of it. So it is covered in both. It was covered in the operating expenses in the Parks and Recreation group and in the capital expenses under like public realm.
Great. Thanks for that, Lorraine. All right, so for the participant who's on the phone, I'm going to unmute you now, or you may need to, it says I've asked you to unmute, so you may need to do something on your end. Oh, there you go. I think you're good to go, and I'll ask you to please keep your question brief so that we can get to a few more before our time is up. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. My question is just about the U.S. Minster Electric Company, sort of the cost-benefit analysis of having our own electric service as opposed, or utility, sorry, as opposed to going with BC Hydro. So is there a benefit to the city, and what's the benefit to the taxpayer?
Great,
as opposed to going with BC Hydro?
Thanks for the question. I'm hopeful that our panelists can answer it. We don't have anyone from the electrical utility here tonight, but I'll turn it over to maybe Lisa.
Well, I can start. So it's just, well, for starters, it's historic. And our utility, I think, is the oldest in the province, and we're only one of a handful of cities with their own electric utility, and it's a source of great pride in the city having our own utility. So basically, we purchased the electricity from hydro at a wholesale rate, and then we sell it at the retail rate, and so the city accrues some additional revenue from that transaction, and then basically the profits, if you will, go into the general revenue each year. So financially, that's sort of the benefit to the city. But we've also been told for years that it's a bit better sort of service level that we provide to ourselves that way. It's primarily residential, and industrial users actually are not part of the utility. And we tend to have a bit better track record on some of the outages as well. That has historically been the issue. And so financially, the benefit to the city is the additional revenues that we receive each year from the utility, and we place that into the general revenue fund. And Lorraine's nodding, so
Yep.
I gave you a correct answer.
Great, thank you. And so our next question from Wendy here in the Q&A box is also related to utilities in general, not necessarily the electrical, but can you please explain how utilities monies appear in revenue, expenditure, and capital expense / debt? I feel like this one might be a bit of a complex answer because we've asked for a few different categories, but Lorraine, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Wendy, for the question. There's a couple of things with regards to utilities when we're building the budgets. We build the budgets in different buckets. So each utility, we build a budget for that utility. So we identify its revenues and expenses and capital expenditures individually to make sure that we understand what's happening in the utility. So we keep it separate from the things we call general fund, which would be legislative services, parks and rec, those types of city services, because they're a type of user pay. In the figures that I was using in the presentation, those were consolidated numbers, and the utility revenue in the revenue slide simply appears in the utilities part of the pie. In the expenditures, the main expenditure for each of the utilities, it goes into the piece of, it goes into, there's a slice of that pie I showed you for each of the utilities. and it shows up, as I said, the major expense for each of the utilities is really the levy that they pay for the provision of services so that they can provide the service. Much like electricity, our water utility, we don't have a water plant in the city. We take the water, we get water from Metro Vancouver and have to pay a levy for this, for the water that we then put through our city pipes and take to the residents and the businesses of the city. Each of the utilities capital programs are associated directly with their revenue streams and expense streams to fund them. And the only utility that has debt is the electrical utility.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm looking at our time and we just have a few minutes left. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to the outstanding 2 questions that are in the Q&A. But as you'll see here on the current slide, we do have an email address that you can submit your questions to if you haven't had a chance to have your questions answered this evening. So on to opportunities for input. I will say just give me about 5 minutes after this webinar has finished to update our webpage to include that survey link. I realized that once we launched the webinar, because I'm the host, I can't actually refresh or publish that update to the webpage, and I wanted to make sure that the Zoom link for this webinar remained online while we were getting ready to start this session. So about 5 minutes after we conclude, the online survey link will be on that newwestcity.ca/budget2021 webpage. That survey is going to be open for a few weeks, so you certainly have time to get to it and to answer it. And you will be posting it on our social media and in City page. So you'll hopefully hear about that opportunity many times between now and when it closes. And we would just ask you to please help us spread the word. So if you know your neighbors or friends in town might like to weigh in as well, please feel free to let them know about our survey and help share that with others. So as we proceed through the Budget 2021 process, as mentioned, we're very early this is our launch of Budget 2021. So there will be many council workshops and meetings where you can watch and also have a chance to participate through delegations to council. You can also send email input to finance and council, and the finance email is up here on your screen. So there will be lots of opportunities as we proceed with the process. And in terms of next steps, so our online survey will be open until October 18th, and then we will be doing some reporting out on those survey results, and that reporting will be to you, the community members, to council, of course, and also to our staff who work to develop our draft capital and operating budgets. So the city departments will start developing those draft budgets for 2021, and then there's our council process where they will have deliberations and the draft budgets will be released. And there will be discussion and again, further opportunities for you to provide your input. And finally, Budget 102 is something that we plan to do in the future. Maybe not in this budget cycle, but we will continue to try to provide information and education to the community members about how all of this works so that you can build on your knowledge and we can build on this 101. So last thing for me is just one more poll. So I'm going to put that up on the screen, and then I will just while you're answering that, I'll ask if our panelists have any final words for us. We just like to know if you found this session useful, if you have a better understanding of the city's finances and budgets through our session. So please answer the poll. And Lisa and Lorraine, any final thoughts before we finish tonight?
Well, I'll start. I think the most important is if we haven't helped you tonight with some of your basic questions, you have to, please phone us and or please email us with questions. We truly are here to help demystify this process because it is complex. I'm the first to admit that I often struggle with how some of the categories work and because some of it's not intuitive, quite frankly. So please phone us, please email us with those questions, and it's our job to make this as transparent as possible. Those are sort of, so we're going to take that to heart this time around.
Thanks for that, Lisa. And I'll just share those poll results. So great to see that many of you, most of you agree or somewhat agree that this, this helped increase your understanding of how the city's finances work. So as Lisa said, please reach out to us with follow-up questions, with yeah, we just want to keep that conversation going. And of course, make sure that in about 5 minutes you head over to the website and feel free to start that survey off as well. Lorraine, any last words before we close the meeting?
No, I would just like to thank you, Jennifer, for being such a great facilitator as always. It's very helpful to have you lead us through this. And I would like to thank all the participants for joining us and making it a worthwhile discussion, particularly the Q&A. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, I'll just echo those thanks to everyone who's here with us this evening. We know that you have a lot of ways that you can spend your time, and we really do appreciate that you've spent some of it with us, and we appreciate your valuable time and participation. And we'll just wish you the rest of the evening a great evening, and we'll see you online and in the survey in the days to come. Thanks, everyone, and we'll end the meeting now.